The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sandra Mitchell pulled her cleaning cart through the empty hallways of Tech Giant Corp. It was 11 p.m., and while most of Silicon Valley's tech workers were home with their families, Sandra's workday was just beginning. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she moved from office to office, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. At 42, this wasn't where Sandra had imagined she'd be. With an MBA from Howard University and 15 years of corporate experience, she should have been sitting in one of these corner offices instead of cleaning them. But life had thrown her several curveballs, and here she was, working the night shift to keep food on the table for her 3 children. "Mom, why do you have to work at night?" her youngest daughter, Tanya, had asked earlier that evening. Sandra had kissed her forehead and tucked her into bed, promising to be there when she woke up for school. "Sometimes we have to do hard things to build a better tomorrow," she told her daughter, the same words her own mother had once said to her. The truth was more complicated. Despite her impressive qualifications, every corporate job interview had ended the same way, with polite rejections and empty promises to keep her resume on file. Sandra knew the real reason. She'd seen the subtle changes in interviewers' expressions when she walked into rooms, the way their enthusiasm dimmed when they realized the Sandra Mitchell with the stellar resume was a black woman. As she cleaned the executive floor, Sandra would sometimes pause to look at the photographs on the walls. Rows of board members and executives, their faces a sea of sameness. Not a single one looked like her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably the most qualified person on this floor after hours, with her MBA gathering dust while she gathered dust bunnies from under desks. But Sandra wasn't bitter. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity wasn't in what you did, but how you did it, so she cleaned each office with the same attention to detail she'd once used to analyze market trends. Her cart was organized with military precision, her cleaning routine as efficient as any business strategy she ever developed. The other cleaning staff had initially been wary of her, an MBA graduate among them seemed suspicious. But Sandra's warm smile and willingness to help had won them over. Now, they shared midnight breaks in the staff room, swapping stories over coffee from the fancy machine meant for daytime executives. Maria, a grandmother from El Salvador, always saved half her sandwich for Sandra, knowing she didn't have time to pack dinner between getting her kids from school and rushing to work. James, a college student working nights to pay for his classes, often asked her advice about his business courses. They'd formed their own little family in the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. Sandra's supervisor, Mr. Peterson, watched her with barely concealed disdain. "Don't forget you're here to clean, not to play executive," he'd sneer whenever he caught her reading papers left on desks. Little did he know that Sandra's habit of reading while she cleaned would soon change everything. That night, as she wiped down the CEO's massive mahogany desk, Sandra noticed something odd in the papers scattered across its surface. After 15 years in corporate finance, she could spot financial irregularities at a glance. The numbers didn't add up. Where most people would see ordinary spreadsheets, Sandra saw a pattern that made her blood run cold. She stood there, cleaning cloth frozen in her hand, as her mind raced through the implications of what she was seeing. Years of corporate experience told her this wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. This was deliberate deception on a massive scale. For a moment, Sandra felt the weight of her cleaning uniform, the late hour, and her precarious position as a single mother. She thought about her children. Marcus, who wanted to go to college next year. Lisa, who needed braces. And little Tanya, who still believed her mother could fix anything. She thought about her grandmother's words about dignity, and her own words to Tanya about doing hard things. Sandra Mitchell straightened her back and tucked the cleaning cloth into her pocket. She might be wearing a cleaner's uniform, but she had an MBA's mind and a mother's determination. Something was very wrong at Tech Giant Corp, and she was the only one in a position to uncover the truth. What she didn't know then was that this night would be the beginning of a story that would shake Silicon Valley to its core. The cleaning lady was about to clean up more than just offices. She was about to clean house in ways no one could have predicted. For the next 2 weeks, Sandra Mitchell developed a careful routine. She kept cleaning as usual but paid special attention to the documents left on desks in the executive offices. Her years of financial experience helped her piece together a disturbing puzzle, one spreadsheet at a time. Late one night, while polishing the glass conference room table, Sandra noticed something that made her stop mid-wipe. Through the clear surface, she could see papers someone had forgotten to collect after a late meeting. The documents contained offshore account numbers that matched suspicious transfers she'd seen in the CEO's office. With trembling hands, Sandra pulled out her phone and carefully photographed the papers. She'd been gathering evidence each night, storing everything in a secure cloud drive she'd created. Her old corporate habits had taught her the importance of documentation. Working in the quietness of night had its advantages. No one questioned why a cleaning lady might take longer in certain offices. During her breaks, Sandra would sit in the small janitor's closet she'd turned into her makeshift office, analyzing the information she'd gathered. The pattern was clear. CEO Richard Thompson and 3 board members were moving company money through a complex network of fake overseas companies. They'd stolen millions of dollars from shareholders, all hidden behind clever accounting tricks. "You're awful quiet these days," Maria commented one night as they shared their usual break. Sandra just smiled and changed the subject. She couldn't risk telling anyone, not even her trusted friend. The stakes were too high. At home, Sandra struggled to maintain normalcy. She'd catch herself staring into space during breakfast, running numbers through her head while her children chatted about school. Dark circles formed under her eyes as she spent her free hours researching securities law and corporate fraud cases. "Mom, are you sick?" Marcus asked one morning, noticing how tired she looked. Sandra hugged her teenage son and assured him everything was fine. But inside, her stomach churned with anxiety. She knew what happened to whistleblowers. She'd read enough cases to understand the risks she was taking. One night, Sandra was cleaning near the HR office when she overheard 2 executives talking late. They were discussing the company's quarterly report, laughing about how they'd massaged the numbers to keep shareholders happy. Sandra's hand tightened on her mop handle as she listened to them joke about their deception. "Hey, cleaning lady," one of them called out, noticing her. "Make sure you get the coffee stains off my desk." They laughed as they walked past, not even bothering to look at her face. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed so easily had once managed portfolios worth millions. That night marked a turning point for Sandra. Hearing their arrogant laughter, watching them casually discuss their fraud while treating her like she was invisible, it stirred something deep inside her. She thought about all the people who'd invested their savings in Tech Giant Corp, believing in the company's integrity. Sandra went home that morning and looked at her children sleeping peacefully. She thought about the lesson she wanted to teach them about right and wrong, about standing up for what's right even when it's hard. She couldn't tell them to be brave if she wasn't willing to be brave herself. After getting the kids off to school, instead of going to sleep, Sandra sat down at her small kitchen table with her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she organized her evidence into a clear, detailed report. Her MBA training proved invaluable as she compiled financial data, timeline of events, and supporting documentation. Just as she finished, Sandra noticed a small detail in one of the photos she'd taken, a post-it note with login credentials to the company's financial system. This could be the key to accessing even more evidence. But using those credentials would be risky. If she got caught. Sandra closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The cleaning lady everyone ignored was about to make the biggest decision of her life. She knew that once she took the next step, there would be no going back. Her job, her family's security, and her future would all be on the line. Opening her eyes, Sandra looked at the family photo on her wall, her 3 children smiling back at her. Then she looked at her Howard University MBA diploma hanging proudly next to it. She'd worked too hard and come too far to stay silent in the face of wrong. With determined fingers, Sandra began typing an email to the SEC. The cleaning lady was about to unleash a storm that would sweep through the pristine halls of Tech Giant Corp, and no amount of corporate polish would be able to shine away what she was about to expose. And the next few days tested Sandra Mitchell's nerves like never before. After sending her initial report to the SEC, she received a response requesting a confidential meeting. That SEC investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Torres, met her at a small coffee shop far from Tech Giant Corp. "Ms. Mitchell, your evidence is compelling," Janet said, reviewing the documents spread between their coffee cups. "But you understand what you're getting into. Whistleblower cases can get ugly." She looked at Sandra with concern. These people have expensive lawyers and a lot to lose. Sandra wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing strength from its warmth. I understand the risks, she replied quietly, but I also understand the risk of staying silent. That night at work, every shadow seemed darker, every sound more threatening. Sandra cleaned the executive offices with extra care, knowing that these same rooms might soon become crime scenes. As she worked, she could hear her grandmother's voice. Baby, doing right ain't always easy, but it's always right. The hardest part was keeping the secret from her children. Marcus, her oldest, noticed something was wrong. Mom, you jump every time your phone rings, he said one morning. What's going on? Sandra pulled him into a hug. Sometimes grown-ups have to handle difficult things, she told him. But I promise you, everything I do is to make sure you kids have a better future. The SEC investigation moved quickly but quietly. Sandra provided them with access to more documents, carefully photographing new evidence during her night shifts. She developed a system: clean, document, photograph, all while appearing to just be doing her regular job. One night, Mr. Peterson, her supervisor, caught her looking at papers on an executive's desk. What do you think you're doing? He demanded. Sandra's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. Just making sure I don't disturb anything while cleaning, sir. She demonstrated by carefully lifting papers to dust underneath. Peterson grunted and walked away, but Sandra knew she needed to be more careful. The stress began taking its toll. Sandra lost weight, her appetite disappearing under the constant pressure. She started keeping a journal, documenting everything in case something happened to her. She wrote letters to each of her children, explaining her actions, to be opened if things went wrong. Late one night, Sandra overheard CEO Thompson in his office, chatting into his phone about unexplained audits and questioning. She froze outside his door, mop in hand, listening to him rage about nosy regulators. When he stormed out, he barely glanced at her, just another invisible worker in the night. The turning point came when Sandra discovered new documents showing the fraud was even bigger than she'd initially thought. The executives weren't just stealing from the company, they were using the money to manipulate stocks, affecting thousands of small investors. That night, Sandra sat in her tiny apartment after her shift, watching her children sleep. Lisa had kicked off her blanket, and Sandra gently tucked it back around her. In the kitchen, she found Marcus's college application spread across the table. On the refrigerator, Tanya's latest art project proclaimed, "My mom is my hero." Sandra pulled out her phone and looked at the SEC investigator's number. She thought about her own mother, who cleaned houses to put her through college. She thought about all the other invisible workers who kept the corporate world running while being looked down upon. Taking a deep breath, Sandra made the call that would change everything. "Ms. Torres, I'm ready to make my formal statement. I want to go on record." The next morning, Sandra packed her children's lunches with extra care, adding little notes of love like she used to do when they were smaller. She hugged each one a little longer before sending them off to school. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and began writing her formal whistleblower statement. Her hands were steady as she typed, years of education and experience flowing through her fingers. The cleaning lady was about to step into the light, and Tech Giant Corp would never see her coming. As she worked, Sandra remembered all the times executives had walked past her without a glance, all the condescending comments, all the assumptions about her intelligence based on her uniform. She smiled slightly as she typed, knowing that soon they would learn a valuable lesson: never underestimate anyone, especially not the woman who cleans your office and reads your papers at night. The first signs of trouble came swiftly. Sandra arrived at work to find her cleaning cart missing. Mr. Peterson stood there with a thin smile, holding a new schedule that cut her hours in half. "Budget cuts," he claimed, though no other cleaners were affected. "We're also reassigning your floors," he added, handing her a list of basement storage rooms and rarely used areas. "And I'll need you to deep clean them all, every night." The assignments were impossible to complete in her reduced hours, and they both knew it. Word had somehow leaked about a whistleblower, and the executive floor was buzzing with tension. As Sandra pushed her borrowed cart past the conference room that evening, she could hear CEO Thompson's voice rising in anger. "Find out who it is," he shouted. "I want to know who's trying to destroy this company." Through the glass, Sandra caught a glimpse of red-faced executives and nervous-looking lawyers. She kept her head down and continued working. The harassment escalated daily. Her locker was broken into, cleaning supplies disappeared, and someone poured coffee all over her freshly mopped floors. Her few work friends started avoiding her, afraid of being associated with the suddenly controversial cleaning lady. Maria, her longtime break companion, caught her alone in the supply closet. "Sandra, I'm sorry," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "They're watching everyone who talks to you. I have grandchildren to support." Sandra hugged her friend, understanding all too well. The worst came during a late-night executive meeting. As Sandra cleaned nearby, she could hear them laughing. "Can you believe some cleaning lady thinks she understands our financial records?" One executive mocked. "She probably can't even balance her own checkbook. Maybe she should stick to balancing her mop bucket," another added, triggering more laughter. Sandra's hands tightened on her broom, but she kept working. Let them laugh. They didn't know about her MBA, her years of experience, or the SEC agents currently combing through every document she provided. At home, things were getting harder to hide from her children. Bills were piling up due to her reduced hours, and the stress was showing. One morning, Lisa found her mother crying at the kitchen table. "Mom, people at school are saying things," Lisa said quietly. "They say their parents heard you're causing trouble at work. Are you in danger?" Sandra pulled her daughter close. "Sometimes standing up for what's right makes people angry," she explained. "But that doesn't mean we stop standing." The next week, Sandra arrived at work to find her small break room office had been emptied. Her personal belongings sat in a box by the dumpster, soaked from the rain. As she salvaged what she could, she heard snickering behind her. "Looking for something?" A group of junior executives stood watching her, coffee cups in hand. "Maybe check the trash where you belong." Sandra stood up slowly, dignity intact. "Thank you for your concern," she said calmly, looking them each in the eye. "I'm sure the SEC will be very interested in how whistleblowers are treated here." Their smirks faded quickly. As they hurried away, Sandra allowed herself a small smile. They still didn't realize who they were dealing with. That night, Sandra received an unexpected call from Janet Torres at the SEC. "They're getting nervous," Janet told her. "We found evidence confirming everything you reported, and more. But Sandra, they're going to come after you hard. Are you sure you want to continue?" Sandra looked at her children's photos on her phone wallpaper. Marcus, who wanted to study business like his mom. Lisa, who stood up to bullies at school. Little Tanya, who still believed in justice and fairness. "Ms. Torres," Sandra replied, her voice firm, "I've spent years being invisible in their offices. They thought a cleaning lady was too simple to understand their schemes, too powerless to challenge them. They were wrong." She paused, watching the lights of the city through her window. "My grandmother used to say that true strength isn't about having power. It's about doing what's right when everyone expects you to stay quiet. I'm not staying quiet anymore." As she ended the call, Sandra felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring more harassment, more challenges, more attempts to break her spirit. But they didn't know what she'd already survived to get here. The cleaning lady they mocked had an MBA, years of corporate experience, and now, ironically, thanks to their own arrogance, access to every piece of evidence needed to bring them down. Let them laugh. The game was far from over. The SEC investigation moved like a silent storm through Tech Giant Corp. Teams of investigators arrived early one Monday morning, their badges flashing as they entered the building. Sandra watched from her tiny apartment through an online news feed as executives rushed in and out, their usual confident struts replaced by worried scurries. Janet Torres led the investigation with precision. Ms. Mitchell's evidence opened up a trail that led to multiple violations, she explained to her team. The financial records she documented are just the tip of the iceberg. The investigators set up in a conference room Sandra used to clean. They went through filing cabinets, computer records, and electronic communications. The same executives who had mocked the cleaning lady now nervously watched as investigators reviewed the evidence she had meticulously gathered. One morning, Sandra received an unexpected call. "Ms. Mitchell, we need you to come in," Janet said. "Your financial expertise could help us understand some of these transactions better." There was a pause. "And Sandra, wear business attire. You're not coming as a cleaner today." Sandra pulled out the suit she hadn't worn since her last corporate interview years ago. As she dressed, Marcus appeared in her doorway. "Mom, you look like you used to when you worked in an office," he said proudly. Walking into Tech Giant Corp's lobby in her suit, Sandra held her head high. The security guard who had checked her cleaning cart for years didn't recognize her at first. When he did, his jaw dropped slightly. The conference room fell silent as Sandra entered. Several investigators were spread around the table, surrounded by documents and laptops. Janet Torres smiled and gestured for Sandra to sit at the head of the table. "Now," Janet began, "Ms. Mitchell, could you walk us through how you first noticed the discrepancies in their financial statements?" The investigators leaned forward, pens ready. Sandra began explaining, her MBA training shining through as she broke down complex financial maneuvers into clear, understandable patterns. She pointed out subtle inconsistencies that even experienced investigators had missed. "See this transfer pattern?" Sandra pointed to a spreadsheet. "They tried to hide it by splitting it across multiple accounts, but if you track the timestamps..." She demonstrated how the money moved through a maze of fake companies. During a break, Sandra went to get coffee from the executive lounge, a place she'd only entered before to clean. She ran into Mr. Peterson, who did a double take at seeing her in a suit. You're the one?" he stammered. "But you're just a..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Just a cleaning lady with an MBA from Howard University and 15 years of corporate finance experience," Sandra completed for him, stirring her coffee calmly. "Funny how appearances can be deceiving, isn't it?" As the investigation progressed, more employees began coming forward with information. Many approached Sandra directly, now seeing her in a completely different light. "I always wondered why you seemed so interested in those financial documents," a young accountant admitted. "I should have known something was wrong too. I'm sorry I didn't speak up." The evidence mounted day by day. Sandra's careful documentation had created a roadmap that led investigators to discover even more fraud than initially suspected. CEO Thompson and his inner circle had stolen nearly $50 million through their schemes. One evening, as the investigation team was wrapping up, Janet pulled Sandra aside. Most whistleblowers just provide a tip and walk away," she said. "But you built an entire case while mopping floors and being harassed. That takes extraordinary courage." Sandra thought about her children, about all the nights she'd spent gathering evidence while worrying about their future. "I did it because some things are worth fighting for," she replied. "And because sometimes the person they least expect to challenge them is exactly the person who can." As she left the building that evening, Sandra passed the wall of executive photos she used to clean. Soon, many of those faces would be replaced. The corporate world that had once shut her out was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging people by their uniforms. The cleaning lady hadn't just exposed fraud. She had demonstrated that integrity and intelligence could be found at every level of a company, and Tech Giant Corp would never be the same. The day of reckoning at Tech Giant Corp arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. News vans lined the street outside the corporate headquarters as the SEC prepared to announce its findings. Inside the building's grand conference room, board members shifted nervously in their expensive leather chairs. CEO Richard Thompson sat at the head of the table, his usual arrogant smile replaced by a grim expression. The door opened, and Janet Torres walked in, followed by her team of investigators. Behind them, dressed in a crisp navy suit, walked Sandra Mitchell. "What is she doing here?" Thompson demanded, half rising from his chair. "This is a board meeting." "Ms. Mitchell is here at our request," Janet announced firmly. "As the whistleblower whose evidence broke this case, she has every right to be present." The room erupted in whispers. Board members who had walked past Sandra for years without a glance now stared openly. One executive actually dropped his coffee cup when he recognized the woman he'd mocked in the hallways. Janet began presenting the investigation's findings. The evidence was devastating. Through Sandra's careful documentation and financial expertise, investigators had uncovered a fraud scheme that went beyond anyone's initial suspicions. "Thanks to Ms. Mitchell's detailed records," Janet explained, "we can prove that Mr. Thompson and 3 board members diverted over $50 million through fake overseas accounts. The evidence is irrefutable." Sandra sat quietly, watching the faces of those who had dismissed her. She thought about all the nights she'd cleaned their offices while gathering evidence, all the times they'd laughed at the cleaning lady who dared to read their documents. Thompson tried one last desperate move. She was just a cleaner. How could she possibly understand complex financial transactions? This is ridiculous. Sandra finally spoke, her voice clear and confident. I hold an MBA from Howard University, Mr. Thompson. Before discrimination forced me to take a cleaning job, I managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. Would you like me to explain exactly how I tracked your fraud, transaction by transaction? The room fell silent. Thompson's face turned pale as Sandra began walking through the evidence, her analysis sharp and precise. She explained complex financial mechanisms with the expertise of a seasoned professional, leaving no doubt about her capabilities. By afternoon, the news had broken worldwide. CEO and board members ousted in massive fraud scheme. Whistleblower revealed as cleaning staff member with MBA. The story captured international attention, with Sandra's journey from cleaner to corporate fraud buster making headlines. The company's largest shareholders called an emergency meeting. They were stunned to learn that the person who had protected their investments was the same woman they'd seen quietly cleaning offices at night. Ms. Mitchell, one major shareholder addressed her directly. We owe you an enormous debt. You risked everything to expose this fraud, and you did it while facing discrimination and harassment. Back at home that evening, Sandra's children hugged her tightly as they watched the news coverage together. Mom, you're a hero, Tanya exclaimed, pointing at the TV where their mother's story was being told. Marcus, her oldest, looked at her with new understanding. Is this why you kept working as a cleaner even though you had an MBA? Because no one would give you a fair chance? Sandra pulled her children close. Sometimes life isn't fair, she explained. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to make things right. The next day, Sandra received calls from news outlets worldwide wanting to tell her story. But the most important call came from Janet Torres. The board wants to meet with you, Janet said. Not as a cleaner, not as a whistleblower, but as a potential executive. They've realized they need someone with both your financial expertise and your integrity. As Sandra prepared for the meeting, she thought about her journey. From corporate professional to cleaning lady to whistleblower, every step had led to this moment. The same executives who had laughed at her would now have to reckon with her true capabilities. She straightened her suit jacket and smiled at her reflection. The cleaning lady they had underestimated was about to show them what real corporate leadership looked like. And this time, she wouldn't be invisible. The vindication wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been judged by their uniform instead of their abilities, every worker who had been overlooked and underestimated. Sandra Mitchell was about to change more than just one company. She was about to change how corporate America saw its invisible workforce. The Tech Giant Corp boardroom looked different from this side of the table. Sandra Mitchell sat in a leather executive chair, no longer holding a mop but instead reviewing company documents as the newly appointed chief ethics officer. The board had agreed to her appointment, but Sandra had conditions of her own. If I take this position, she had told them firmly, we're going to make real changes. Starting with how we treat every employee in this building, from the CEO to the cleaning staff. Her first week as an executive was eye-opening for everyone. Sandra arrived early each morning, making a point to greet the cleaning crew, her former colleagues, by name. She knew their stories, their struggles, and their potential. Many had degrees from their home countries or dreams of education they couldn't afford to pursue. Maria, Sandra called out to her old friend one morning. Could you come to my office later? I'd like to discuss the education assistance program I'm developing. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Sandra, no longer afraid to be seen associating with her. Sandra's first major initiative was creating the Equal Opportunity Development Program. It provided education funding and career advancement paths for support staff, including cleaners, security guards, and maintenance workers. The program also offered mentorship opportunities and skill development workshops. The corporate culture began to shift. Executives who had once ignored support staff now learned to see them as valuable team members. Sandra made sure of it by including professional development stories in company meetings. When Maria's grandson graduated from college thanks to the new program, this picture went up on the company's achievement wall alongside executive successes. One day, Sandra encountered Mr. Peterson in the hallway. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes. Miss Mitchell, he mumbled, about how I treated you before. Mr. Peterson, Sandra interrupted gently. What matters is how we treat people now. Would you like to help me develop better working conditions for our cleaning staff? Her approach to ethics wasn't just about preventing fraud. It was about creating a workplace where everyone's dignity and potential were respected. She implemented transparent financial practices, established clear reporting channels for concerns, and insisted on fair hiring practices across all levels. The changes weren't always easy. Some executives resisted, clinging to old attitudes. During one tense meeting, a vice president complained about the cost of the education program. "Let me explain the return on investment," Sandra responded, pulling up a presentation. She demonstrated how investing in employees reduced turnover, increased productivity, and improved company culture. Her MBA training combined with her personal experience made her arguments impossible to dismiss. Word of tech giants' transformation spread through Silicon Valley. Other companies began reaching out, wanting to learn about their ethics and development programs. Sandra found herself speaking at corporate events, sharing her unique perspective on building truly inclusive workplaces. One evening, as Sandra packed up her new corner office, she heard a knock. A young woman in a cleaning uniform stood nervously in the doorway. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm taking business classes at night, and I wondered, could I ask your advice?" Sandra smiled warmly, remembering her own journey. "Come in," she said, clearing space at her conference table. "Tell me about your dreams." At home, her children noticed the changes too. Marcus proudly told his college counselor about his mother's work. Lisa started a club at school focusing on corporate responsibility. Even little Tanya drew pictures of her mom in a business suit, standing next to people in all kinds of uniforms. 6 months into her role, Sandra organized a company-wide meeting. As she stood at the podium, she could see faces she knew from every level of the company: executives, middle managers, support staff, and cleaning crews. All were there as equals, all part of the same team. "At Tech Giant," she began, "we're proving that a company's true value isn't just in its profit margins. It's in how we recognize and develop the potential in every person who walks through our doors." Looking out at the audience, Sandra saw Maria dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She saw Mr. Peterson nodding thoughtfully. She saw young employees from the cleaning crew sitting up straighter, perhaps seeing their own futures differently. The cleaning lady they had once mocked was now leading them toward a better way of doing business. And this was just the beginning. Sandra Mitchell was showing corporate America that true leadership could come from any level, even from someone holding a mop. 5 years had passed since Sandra Mitchell first discovered the fraud at Tech Giant Corp. Now, she stood at the podium of the company's annual shareholders meeting as its newly appointed CEO, the first black woman to hold this position in Silicon Valley's history. The journey from that night shift cleaning job to the executive suite hadn't been easy, but it had transformed both Sandra and the company. Under her leadership as Chief Ethics Officer, Tech Giant had become known as one of the most progressive and successful companies in the tech industry. "Today, I want to share our latest numbers," Sandra announced to the packed auditorium. "Our profits have doubled. Employee retention is at an all-time high, but the statistics I'm most proud of are these. 200 employees have graduated from college through our education program. 500 have been promoted from support roles to management positions. And our workforce diversity now reflects the real world." In the front row, Sandra's children beamed with pride. Marcus had graduated from business school and now ran Tech Giant's Equal Opportunity program. Lisa was in law school, focusing on corporate ethics. Tanya, now in high school, had started a mentorship program for underprivileged students. Maria, no longer cleaning but serving as the head of employee development, sat nearby. She had been one of the first to benefit from Sandra's changes, earning her business degree and proving herself as capable as anyone else. "Remember when we used to share sandwiches in the break room?" Maria whispered to Sandra after the meeting. They both laughed, remembering those late nights that seemed so long ago. The company's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Business schools now taught the Tech Giant model of corporate ethics and employee development. Sandra regularly received invitations to speak at major companies, sharing her vision of workplace equality. One morning, Sandra arrived early at her office, the same one she used to clean. She still made a point of knowing every employee's name, from the newest intern to the cleaning staff. The security guard, James, had just finished his MBA through the company program. "Good morning, CEO Mitchell," he said with a grin, remembering how they used to greet each other during her night shifts. "Good morning, future executive," she replied, noting the textbook under his arm. In her office, Sandra kept a few special items: her old cleaning uniform, framed next to her MBA diploma and CEO appointment letter. It reminded her daily of where she'd come from and why her work mattered. The morning's meetings included a review of the company's latest initiative, a partnership with Howard University to provide internships and job opportunities to students from underrepresented backgrounds. Sandra smiled, thinking of her younger self, fresh from Howard with an MBA, but facing closed doors. Later that day, Sandra visited the company's new learning center where employees could take classes and receive training. She paused to watch a group of cleaning staff attending a financial management course, the same kind of knowledge she'd used to expose fraud years ago. "Ms. Mitchell," one of them called out, "your story inspired us. Thank you for showing us that our uniforms don't define our potential." That evening, as Sandra prepared for a board meeting, her assistant brought in a familiar face. Mr. Peterson, her former supervisor. Now retired, he had asked to see her. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "And I want you to know that watching you transform this company taught me more about leadership than 40 years in management ever did." Sandra's legacy went beyond profits and corporate success. She had created a workplace where dignity and opportunity weren't determined by uniforms or titles, where a cleaning lady could become CEO, not because it made a good story, but because she had always had the capability. As she looked out her office window at the setting sun, Sandra thought about all the invisible workers in buildings across America, the cleaners, guards, maintenance staff, each with their own dreams and potential. Her phone buzzed with a message. Another company wanted her to speak about corporate transformation. Sandra smiled, knowing what she would tell them. True change starts with seeing the potential in every person, regardless of their position. The cleaning lady who became CEO had done more than clean up corporate fraud. She had shown that leadership can come from anywhere, that dignity belongs to everyone, and that success means lifting others as you climb. And in offices across Silicon Valley, people still told the story of Sandra Mitchell, the cleaning lady who changed corporate America forever.